This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFC Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. Today is Sunday, March the 10th. Yes, it is now 11 o'clock, even though the clock I'm looking at says 10. Obviously, we haven't sprung into the future by an hour here at WEFT. This is the Prairie Monk Show, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways. It is actually kind of green out there today. And everything else conservation-like that Dave has been thinking about for the last week. Do you want to talk about daylight savings? You always like that? It's always your favorite topic?
I am really opposed to daylight saving. I think it's one of those things where humans play with nature, and there's a lot of biological rhythms that are disturbed by this maneuver, and I wonder if it costs the nation a lot of money, as there are 2 states that don't do this, and I hope that other states would follow their example. We mess with the nature a lot, but this seems to be one that doesn't really need to be messed with. I would like to say something about Bernadine Stake. She passed just this last week or so, and she was a leader in this community, and I like to say something about people who do interesting things, because it helps us to understand that we too can do some of these sorts of things, and so her life gives us an example to go by. She grew up in Indian country on the eastern side of Nebraska, the northeastern side. Her parents were farmers, and they lived near to an Indian reserve, and they grew up being sympathetic to cultural differences. At the age, the parents were in that era when father didn't go to high school but was well educated in his own way. Mother did get to go to high school, and she was one of many children. At age of 17, she graduated from high school, and while she was doing that, she took courses in how to become a teacher, and then she taught in a one-room school. She graduated from the University of Nebraska in education. She married Bob Stake, who was also an educator, and later a professor of education at the University of Illinois. The family moved to Urbana and the University of Illinois in the early 60s. They had 4 children, and they settled on a house near to Carl Park, which became a part of the family's close proximity. She shortly became a community activist, but at the same time she obtained a master's degree in education and then a doctorate in educational psychology. She worked with projects like Plato, and she worked with her husband in projects that are related to educational evaluation. She concentrated on science and math teaching and how children would respond to certain procedures. She was shortly a political person, and she belonged to the city council for 16 years, on and off, and was on the planning commission for 20 years after that. She ran for mayor and only missed by 300 odd votes. She was an innovator, a challenger, a trailblazer, and always with the public in mind and with a smile. She was a good loser, but she was prepared to be outspoken. She was involved in local and national affairs, including women's affairs and other national interests. She promoted a walkway on Race Street, which has been installed. She helped raise $13,000 to keep the Laredo Taft statue of Lincoln in the Carl Park area near to the high school. She pushed for recycling, historic preservation, and green space. She was a human rights person. She was also on our Heartland Pathways board, amongst other boards and committees that she belonged to. She and Bob were stalwarts in the Unitarian Church, and in recent years she was facing dementia. She died while taking a short walk in Carl Park with helpers. That was probably a blessing in disguise, because going through Alzheimer's is not a fun procedure. She was 92. She will be missed. Our sympathies go to Bob and Bernadine's children, Jeffrey, Ben, Sarah, and Jacob, and their children, and even great-grandchildren. Bernie will be missed, and just have fond memories of association with Bernadine and her zeal to write letters to the newspaper to improve public and political interaction. Changing the subject, I went to PSCC, Prairie State Conservation Coalition meetings at Starved Rock, and last week we went through some of the things that happened at that meeting, some of them quite inspirational, but very informative. I did note that we had some acoustic problems, and I wrote a note about that and sent it off to Mark Rubel, because he is in Nashville, Tennessee, and he is a specialist in sound recording, and so in our ongoing activities, looking at sound is of concern. David is also concerned about that. He keeps me with my face right on top of the mic, because modern day mics are very much, you have to be right close to them. If you stand away a matter of feet, then you're not going to be heard, and you're going to have a board, and if you're going to put the sound up, you're going to decapitate some of those sound waves so that they're not as listenable to. So, and I sent that off to one of the activists in the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, David Holman, and he is technician enough that he can probably follow up on some of the simple things that you can do, like you don't stand away from the mic. So that means a little note to speakers beforehand, and perhaps even a reminder as they speak. And it might mean that you use lavaliers rather than mics, and you lift the mic to your face. I came back via the back roads. That's kind of on Pungent. I came down Route 16 and talked to people on the way. There was a crew with a jeep, and I think what they were doing was picking up blown material that had storms, and blowing material was in the roadsides, and the ground was still hard enough that you could drive on the side. They told me to go down to Gridley, and there would be a little gas station out in the middle of nowhere. It certainly was out in the middle of nowhere, and I needed gas, and got it there. And I talked to a lady that came along. When I first arrived, there were no one there. When I left, there were about 5 different groups lined up for gas, including a semi-trailer. So the lady I talked to directed me to Gridley down the road. The gas station was at Flanagan, and the road to Lexington. I'd been there before to meetings, and I reminisced. I enjoyed going to little towns and finding out how they work and do. At the entrance to the town from the north, there's a large building. It's quite impressive. And the lady I was talking to told me that it's used for receptions and things like that from time to time, and it's called the Castle. I took some photographs and then went to a gas station around the corner and asked. I knew there was a historic cemetery there, so I asked about it. The person behind me explained where the cemetery was. I was looking for a cemetery that was a little more modern than the one he sent me to. He sent me to a small cemetery on a hill, and he was kind enough to follow me around to make sure that I found it. This is probably a cemetery that wasn't looked after very well. We find those cemeteries, and sometimes they have prairie on them. But this was mown. The graves stones had been placed down as if on a lawn, and they went back to the 1830s, 40s, 50s. There were some upright stones still left, so a silhouette very near to Route 66, which is the old road that runs from Chicago to L.A., and it has had various different roads as things were modified, but it goes through Lexington, and it more or less parallels 55, and it is somewhat loaded with prairie, so it's a sight to be enjoyed. I drove up over the railroad line, and the railroad line is active. They're active with the long trains, and but there was an elevator there, and the elevator had kept its old wooden elevators, and the old loading docks, and the old windows, old side door openings, and I just enjoyed looking at that and realizing that there were modern buildings right alongside, and a railroad line, which is a siding where grain can be loaded without being on the main line. But a little wiggly-woggly because it hasn't been used an awful lot. These days, a lot of grain is on the road, but I'm sure that the rails still took out grain from Lexington. I drove slowly down the main street. The gentleman that followed me to the little cemetery had told me how to get through town to get back to Champaign via the back roads. And so it was Pine Street that I came across Vine Street and turned down Vine Street, and some people there told me that where Pine Street was just down the road. The main street continues through the town to a memorial park near to the city garage, and there were some old buildings there. Took some photographs of them. Then back down Main Street, there are antique dealers there, so it's a little different, but the buildings are maintained. And then I went down Pine Street, and there were old buildings that were sometimes 3 stories high with a widow walk on top. A widow walk is probably emanated from the east, and so these settlers were probably coming from the east. A widow's walkways where you watched the sailors coming back in from fishing, and they didn't always make it home. In the Midwest, it was also a place from which you could observe the prairie, and so those houses were big for large families in an era when you had 6, 8, and 10 children and more, and they were part of the workforce, and it was a different era. And so I hesitated there for just a little while, and then took 23 down to Saybrook. Well, I took 9 east when I got to Saybrook, and I could have gone a little further and gone on to 74, but I wanted to go through the country. It was nighttime by now, and there were orange lights, rows of orange lights. And then I realized that these were lights that were on windmills that were generating power. And came through Arrowsmith. Arrowsmith was a little town with a sign on the outside, no windmills through town. The vehicles that carry the windmills are very long and probably a little invasive of the town. And I kept coming, and Saybrook is an interesting town because it was owned by one family, and if you had a house on it, you had to, I think you had to build your own house, but it had to be painted yellow. And so that tradition has been maintained. I eventually got to Gibson City, and you always know when you're at Gibson City because there's a huge amount of silo or elevators there, and there's manufacturing, and you get the smell of soybean and corn processing. And so I'm sure that if you grew up in Gibson City and you come back to Gibson City, it's one of those things the smell would bring you back to home. So then I got on to 47, came south to Mahomet and back to town. So just that small experience is something that I would like to encourage you to do when you go through small communities, to see how they have survived. Sometimes the fact that they haven't had a lot of industrial development or the like means that the old buildings stay, and it sometimes means that the old buildings don't get replaced by a hamburger stand or a modern bank, so that the streetscape remains intact. And just to talk to people and find them so friendly and so helpful, it was nice. To go to the cemetery and look at the sign at the back, which was in wood, along with the trees that defined the area, that were trees that belonged to an era when the trees like Osage oranges and others were planted so close that a hog or chicken didn't really want to push their way through them. And those trees were also harvested for wood, so I could see the stumps of a past era where part of the hedge or Osage orange, I don't know that these were Osage oranges, but the same type of thing delineated the small cemetery. I didn't get to go to the next level of historic cemetery, but it too is loaded with gravestones that tell the history of this place, the ethnology, where did these people come from? Were they English or German, or they wouldn't have been Latin at that time. So you just can wander around these places and enjoy an informal history lesson. Some of these towns are getting developed. It was called Scroggin Cemetery, and there was not only a wooden sign, but a Masonic or a sign put together with the Masons, and all the names of the people that were researched and buried in that cemetery, because often they would be buried without a headstone, and if there was a headstone, it may have been decayed. Limestone gravestones are subject to acid rain, and they can be the writing on them, the picture, the carvings are somewhat obliterated by that. The sign was accompanied with a flag of respect, and I appreciated the fellow who followed me and told me where it was in case I went past. The gravestones dated back to the Civil War or earlier, and we'll try and give you some pictorial opportunity to see that sort of thing. So let me see what. 30 minutes. Okay. I want to expand a little bit on some of our prairies. We have gone through an era of educational resources in environmental science, which has been our mother company. That has helped us to promote the removal of a Greek revival cottage and do a lot of other things with early preservation, like on Route 45 or Windsor Road or Lake Park. These are all places where we've been involved, but we don't own the prairies, and we promote their preservation. Not always easy. These areas need to be mown to simulate fire, or better yet, they need to be fired. That's not always easy to work with the railroads, the Department of Transportation, or other groups to get those places burned sensibly so that the prairie appreciates their tradition of being set afire by lightning. And in this era, when you have housing and shopping centers all around and a railroad and a road, you have to have people who know how to burn a prairie at a low wind speed, and to know that the wind can change. You have to do a little at a time instead of burning a drainage ditch, which is often burned by farmers, and it can burn in 10 minutes. We may take half a day or more to burn slowly. We start off with just 10 square feet and sample the situation. Then we go down the line and then put in fire breaks so that we burn a little corridor and let it burn in one direction and let it burn in the other direction, and have flappers and brakes to put the fire out so that when the fire moves, it doesn't move in a very fast manner. That's our fear, is that some of these places will take a cigarette butt at some stage and burn uncontrollably, and then put smoke over railroads and roads and cause a kerfuffle. We need to be in control of that. How to get that done takes probably some statute at the state level and at the railroad level to make sure that they know what we're doing, and we are there with their acceptance and understanding. That sometimes can take 5 years to work on, and in the meantime the prairie gets weaker and weaker because the litter accumulates and becomes a fire hazard, but it also stops the heat and light coming into the plant early in the season, and so it degenerates, because this is an ecosystem that's dependent on fire, and if you don't fire it, it gets to be a nuisance, and when that catches fire spontaneously with either the usual lightning or by someone throwing a match into it, it causes such a problem that it makes sure that the community does not want to have a fire anymore. So then it gets to be exacerbated. So we have to try and get this together very carefully, and that's the sort of thing that the Prairie State Conservation Coalition would think about and organize state statutes. One of the statutes that's going through at the moment is stewardship for agencies like trusts that have 501c3s for tax exemption, and and can work on this sort of situation, but they need money for zoot suits, money for jeeps or small all-terrain vehicles that can carry water, to have hoses and spraying equipment, and have flappers, and to put out fires gently before they get to be into an inferno that you can't get near. And so that has been passed as a governmental issue, and so we hope for that. Going back to rental, last week I talked about Read Across America, and it was at Lincoln Square Mall with lots and lots of people there. This is a national effort. You have politicians. Frericks was at some of these things. He was the state treasurer, or I'm not quite sure what his position is, but it's a chance for parents to bring their children, and they have to go through a number of events where they'll have to take a card and check out that they've been to this event and they've been involved. It does involve reading and mapping, or doing simple tasks that kids can get involved in. At this meeting, the Lincoln's Challenge was involved, more or less as prefects, helping here and there. Lincoln's Challenge is a organization that's become quite respected in the state. It is located at Rantoul, and it has been popular enough to have a new building built on what was the old Air Force Base. And the purpose of the Lincoln's Challenge is to take wayward children that have stepped over the tracer's son and give them some discipline and give them a chance to rethink their lifestyle. A little prairie up the road, about probably 3 miles away, is a candidate for working with these sorts of young folk. We have a vacant lot nearby that has been farmland, but is not being farmed anymore. And we've often looked at this respectfully, because we attempted to think about a kickstart to try and buy the 8 acres and plant it to prairie. We have a prairie of 9 acres, and it is has been a borrow pit. A borrow pit is where you borrow gravel from the moraine where glaciers drop the glacial till, and it's borrowed for road improvement. Theoretically, the borrow means that when you open the new road and the old road is obsolete, you bring the material back. That doesn't happen, but technically it's still regarded as a borrow pit or a gravel pit. And that has surrounds that have remnant prairie, and we're very jealous of remnant prairies. There are very, very few. This is where the status of the vegetation and the creatures that are associated, the butterflies and the bees and the microorganisms and the bacteria and the fungi and whatever, are still intact. So, and on the borrow pit side of things, there's been 8 feet of gravel removed. So you don't have that sort of remnant prairie status. But we have a site that has got an old road adjacent to it, a modern road where one of the legs of the modern road was not developed, and an old interurban space, and a railroad line. And so those spaces have remnant prairies on them, and we can take that seed and move it over to the borrow pit. So the borrow pit is over probably 70 years or more, has gradually become an interesting and an exciting prairie. It's not the sort of prairie that you want to encourage tourists to be walking through. Visitors, okay, but and they can more or less simulate a buffalo walking through the prairie, and the soils have become harder, which means that some of the invasive species that like soft, fertile soil are not going to grow so easily, and prairie seeds that are used to hard soil and low fertility soil sometimes can grow quite well. And so our prairie, that 9 acres, is a part of garden and part of remnant preservation. We cherish it. Some of it, a little part of it has been experimentally plowed for corn and soybeans, and that we can restore too. It's happening. We've been at it for a number of years, but long before we were at it, there were other people who were very much aware of that site. The site next door, which is about 8 acres, is interesting because we have, coming off that moraine, water that runs off what used to be glacial ice, eventually became no ice when the climate warmed and the glaciers retreated, but it left this moraine of rock and rubble, and then as the glaciers dried, so the loess, or the windblown material, blew across the country. We're thinking that 8 acres could be a place where prairie could be reconstructed and give people an introduction to the more sophisticated prairie a little to the north. 6 acres of an adjacent piece of that same land has been put into a cemetery reserve for future graves, and they've planted prairie there in sort of understanding that we have prairie up the road, and so the cemetery people have done a lot to help us take out endangered species, and sometimes they've been willing to pick up some of the trash that gets dumped there regularly. Fortunately, the Department of Transportation has decided that road should be closed, so we now have a gate and a key to the gate, and it's a substantial gate, so it's not the sort of thing where a tandem truck can go down and dump garbage. But the 8 acres we were looking at, we're thinking that there are things that Lincoln's Challenge could be interested in. One of them is just the sketching and understanding of plants, the understanding of the history in the cemetery nearby, the understanding of the railroads and their arrival in town, the understanding of the moraine and the continental nature of this ice sheet coming south and bringing very, very fertile soils. The drainage patterns, the gentle drainage off the backside of the moraine going towards Paxton, and the more rapid drainage from the front of the moraine going to places like Flatville. So we would like to have an example of the wet, swampy, Flatville-like territory. And there is indeed in the south side of the cemetery an area that is damp and wet and not suitable for farming. It's loaded with invasive teasel plants, but it would be a prime place to demonstrate the transect between Rantoul and up over the Bloomington Moraine, so that you get the outwash plain, which is damp, and you get the cemetery history, but you're going up the hill, and on the top of the hill you get drier species, and you get loess, Loess, that has been blown across the country as the glaciers retreated. We would like to extend our complex at Rantoul to Paxton, and this is old concrete road all the way to Paxton, and that we would like to do things like I did just recently. Somebody came from the east, wanted to see the prairie, so he came south. I met him at Paxton, showed him the Paxton cemetery, the Prospect Cemetery, and showed him the old concrete road. It is minus its culverts, because when you retire a road or a railway line, there's a federal law that mandates that you take out the culverts so that they don't become a place where people can jump off and commit suicide or whatever. So the road is not totally complete. It's not the sort of thing that you put a vehicle on and travel south, but it's there and it can be visited. And if places like the Lincoln's Challenge could be interested, there are, first of all, invasive olive trees and teasels that could be removed. There are storylines that could be written. We are aware that there are books that are written for children, and there are books that children can work with. And we think that there's physical things to be done. There's seed to be collected. There's drainage patterns to be worked on so that they don't just go everywhere. There are interpretive trails that could be put in. And so we're dreaming. And we've separated out Heartland Pathways from some of the educational resources and environmental science things that we've been doing over the years. And we think that we're very near to trying to put together a group of people who might be interested in the future of that corridor. And how might it relate to Rantoul itself? At Rantoul there was an east-west railroad line. It was called the Pumpkin Vine because it waddles around a little bit. It took off a main line at Leroy and came across through Fisher, Dewey, Rantoul, Dillsburg, Armstrong, and into Lafayette, Indiana. It was closed out in pieces. The Fisher Grain and Coal Company bought the line 8 miles from Fisher into Rantoul, and then across the main line Canadian National, and then up the hill, through urban territory, and up the hill to Dillsburg, and on to Gifford, where when that railroad line closed out, we were very aware that there was some of our only prairie on the railroad bed, so we formed the Grand Prairie Friends, and they worked with Wendy Garrison and others to buy 1 mile of railroad bed, and it's not ideal. It's too narrow. But it's all we have, and it's on the end of that line. So when you look at the area going north on 45, and when you go south, you go into Rantoul, and 3 miles of that railroad line was closed out recently by a Fisher Grain and Coal Company, and donated to the city. And they've spent a couple of $1 million, I'll bet, on putting it into a trail that is heavily used and popular in Rantoul. We tried to get the other 3 miles up the hill to Dillsburg. It didn't happen. The farmers were looking at more corn and soybeans. And it's returned to that pattern. The bridges have been taken out from the drainage ditch which sits across the corridor. So that would cost a lot to replace if we were thinking of a trail up the hill and up the Bloomington Moraine. So we're dreaming. We don't exactly know quite what we want in the future, and some of it's going to have to come from other people's minds that have the twinkle in their eye and they dream. And so at the moment we're dreaming, and part of it has to do with the Prairie State Conservation Coalition meeting, where a woman was talking very seriously about working with, and excitedly, about working with children and fourth graders perhaps. And just so you put these things together, and you hope you may try some things that might not work, like we didn't get the 3 miles up the hill, which was sort of, we were talking to the Fisher Grain and Coal Company about. But that line up the hill is not too different from the line up 45, where, so to the south, you can connect our 45 corridor to the east-west pumpkin vine trail that goes through Rantoul, east-west, and up to Dillsburg. Quite interesting. Many of the things we do don't have a pure answer. This week I've been talking a lot to Tom Scott, who is president of the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad bed, which we hope will open up between Whiteheath and Champaign and allow historic trains to come in from Monticello Railroad Museum to Champaign. And you have to think about, where would you park this train? How do you work with the elevators? There's 2 elevators on the line. Could they're lacking a weighbridge, and if you're going to move grain, you have to have a weighbridge at one end or the other, and if they sell to poultry farmers in the south, there's no weighbridge. So could you back a small train up into Kraft Humco, which has a weighbridge? And how much would you have to pay for it? Could you have to work with Canadian National, because they own the active line from Seymour into Bonneville and Staley, at where 57 goes north-south. And that line has been abandoned at the moment, but that tracks are still there. So can we re-rail between Whiteheath and Seymour on land that's owned by Heartland Pathways, and then could we acquire the rails that are still intact between Seymour and Bonneville and Staley? The Staley elevator has been taken down. The other two elevators put their grain on the road, which is hard on the roads, and it takes a lot of energy. Can we get the railroad to come back in a cooperative fashion? Can we provide a weighbridge so those two elevators can weigh their grain as it goes out? Can we work with the like of Kraft Humco to do that? How would we work with the Canadian National, which still owns the active line, to provide gravel and plastic and commodities, or they pull commodities out of there, still active? How do you dream about doing this when the city is thinking of multi-million-dollar ice hockey rink and hotels and the like? Can you begin to dream about bringing a train into an area between State and Randolph Street, then think about whether you can combine that with bicycles that come through from the Kickapoo Trails through Havana, through Champaign, and settle on a little park that used to be where the Big Four railroad station is. So I'm encouraging you out there to think about, think big. And don't be worried if it doesn't work. The idea may be good. You might try a sample of it. It might not work. But it involves you with working with politicians. That person who's on the local committee at Champaign or Urbana might then be a county board member, then perhaps a state person, and some of these concepts need state recognition and state support, and then federal support. So dream and think about documenting it. Just don't dream, but find some diagrams. The city of Champaign has wonderful maps of the area where the Canadian National is met by the Norfolk Southern that comes in from Bloomington. It's active, and how can you work with an agency that is monolithic and has rules of the game, and you have to work with attorneys to decide little things like, can we have a prairie and burn it occasionally?
1 minute.
So we have 1 minute, and that's it's time to be out of here. We thank you for listening, and some of this is a little repetitive, but we want you to get the idea that there are resources out there that can be useful if you are prepared to find out about them, and we are prepared to let you know about them and do interesting things. So thanks for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. As always, the views and opinions expressed here are solely those of the speakers and no one else.